Welcome. My name is Judge Karima Hill Harvey, and I am the chair of the Sarasota County Bar Association's Council for Diversity and Inclusion. Lately, it seems that we read and see reports on almost daily basis about physical attacks on Asian American Pacific Islanders, attacks that have led to deaths and horrible injuries for innocent people. These attacks are happening all over America. The month of May is designated as Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month. In recognition of this, the Sarasota County Bar Association, through its Council for Diversity and Inclusion, believe it is most appropriate to present today's panel discussion. We will look at the troubling rise in hate crimes against Asian American Pacific Islanders. Our panelists today have in-depth experience and expertise with these matters. They will help us better understand why this is happening now and what we can do about it. But first, some housekeeping items. Today's presentation was made possible by generous sponsorship of the Community Foundation of Sarasota. And for our Zoom participants, you will have a chance later to ask questions of our panelists. Please type your questions into the chat box. We will collect and address those questions in the second half of the program. And now, let me introduce today's panel. Our first panelist is Julie Liang. Ms. Liang is the Senior Assistant General Counsel of the Sarasota County Sheriff's Office. She also is the first generation Chinese American born to immigrants from Taipei, Taiwan, and a former Assistant State Attorney for the 6th Judicial Circuit, where she focused on juvenile gang prosecution. Next, we have Dr. Brendan Lance. Dr. Lance is an assistant professor at the Florida State University College of Criminology and Criminal Justice in Tallahassee. He also is the director of the Hate Crime Research and Policy Institute at FSU. His research interests focus on hate crimes, violence, victimization, and co-offending. Dr. Lance was a Bureau of Justice Statistics graduate research fellow and was recently awarded the 2021 Academy New Scholar Award from the Academy of Criminal Justice Sciences. His research has been published in numerous scholarly journals, including the British Journal of Criminology, Justice Quarterly, Psychology of Violence, Criminal Justice and Behavior, Crime and Delinquency, and the Journal of Experimental Criminology, among others. He frequently appears in various media as guest commentator on the topic of hate crimes. Our third panelist is Siyu Jung. Ms. Jung is an attorney with the Immigration Law and Litigation Group in Miami. She serves as chair of the American Immigration Lawyers Association's Executive Office for Immigration Review, Immigration and Customs Enforcement Joint Liaison Committee. Ms. Chung is a past president of the AAPI South Florida chapter. She also serves as treasurer of the board of the American Immigration Council, as vice president of the board of Catholic Legal Services, and she is a leader of the Florida Bar's Diversity and Inclusion Committee. Ms. Chung is the 2019 recipient of the inaugural AAPI National Diversity and Inclusion Award, and previously received the Michael Maggio Pro Bono Service Award from AAPI National. She began her career at the Board of Immigration's Appeal through the U.S. Department of Justice's Attorney General Honors Program. These accomplished individuals have graciously volunteered their time to help us better understand the recent rise in hate crimes against Asian American Pacific Islanders. I'll now turn it over to our panelists.
Thank you so much, Judge Hill. I want to just thank the Sarasota Bar for having us today. Jay Castle, Holly Lips, Ilyas Sayag, and in particular, Charlie Ann Cypret. She is the chair of the Florida Bar Diversity and Inclusion Committee. I'm a member of that committee on the Executive Council, and she was nice enough to introduce me to Jay, and it's such a pleasure to be here and have this opportunity. If we didn't have Zoom, I probably wouldn't have this opportunity, so thank you so much. I'm really excited to learn today from my co-panelists, and I'm going to start off, immigration's my expertise, having some discussion on historical context, and my co-panelists will join in on some of that discussion. So we can start with the framework of where some of the discrimination, prejudice, hate may have started resulting from immigration law and policy. So first, I want to start with just the naming of the group. So Asian or Pacific Islander. That was determined in 1997 to be two distinct racial categories. Preparing for this panel, I learned that we've actually been changed this month, not to AAPI Heritage Month, but Asian American Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander Heritage Month. So that was done by President Biden in the first 100 days. And so there has been an evolution to the meaning of this month, and looking at the issues and celebrating the cultures that are encompassed in this title. And not forgetting Native Hawaiians who have suffered a lot of discrimination, a lot of loss in their land, a lot of controversy pertaining to that, and reacquiring, reaccessing ancestral lands that formerly belonged to them. So what is it that this group actually does have in common together, and why are we unified in this manner? It could be that some of it results from, well, the Asian American community really seeing the immigration impact, but also resulting from colonization and seeing some commonalities between the groups. But really, I think, how that could be and is interpreted more in popular culture or in common narrative is this perspective or this being received as a foreigner and not quite yet assimilated. And so this is a common theme both categories do face. And I think that trying to find, and there's a lot of academic research, trying to find an ability to advocate because it is a very, very large group, and it's very difficult to just advocate on one side of it. I think when people think about Asian Americans, perhaps they identify more with, depending on where you're from, in the United States, I think a lot of people think of people from East Asia, perhaps from China, Japan, Korea. If you're in the UK, people are going to be thinking more of South Asian. So really context really makes a difference when thinking about this very, very vast population. But going back to immigration law and policy, where do we really see the derivation and the problem starting with Asian American hate crimes, Asian American prejudice against Asian Americans, discrimination? This really dates back even before the Chinese Exclusion Act. So I think that many of you are probably familiar with the Chinese Exclusion Act, maybe not, but remembering that it's a little bit more than just the Chinese Exclusion Act. This was decades-long discrimination and a lot of riots and difficulty between Chinese American laborers who came to work in the gold mines, to work on the railroad, and decades-long propaganda and information that finally led to federal action refusing to allow Chinese immigrants or people of Asian descent to immigrate. So on one end, new immigrants, but also for those who are here, that were here to become citizens. So it's rooted in a very, very long history of exclusion, discrimination, racism, xenophobia. It's not something that's new, although based on the gravity and the violence that we've seen over the last month, it is reflected in the media more, but I want to have a conversation about that too. But this Asian American violence is not something that is new. So what was before the Chinese Exclusion Act? It really started with anti-immigrant law targeting Asian women. It was the 1875 Page Act. It was one of the earliest pieces of legislation to restrict immigration to the United States. And it was really framed in a way that made it sound not that harmful, but the effects on the Chinese community were tremendous. So the Page Law was that women were depicted as a disease threat. And I think, Brendan, you probably can give us a little bit more context and information on this too. So Chinese women were perceived as a particular threat, a sexual one. We see some of these stereotypes still prevalent in media, pop culture today. You know, my daughter was watching Mean Girls recently, and there was very sexualized messaging and component about teenage girls of Asian American descent. So, you know, we're seeing some of these themes play out over and over again, and I don't think we can minimize the derivation. So the PAGE Act was to limit those people who were coming in for lewd or immoral purposes. And so what it permitted the US government to do is when Asian women or Chinese women were coming in, they were subject to tremendous scrutiny, a lot of types of examination, very intrusive means that were just so demoralizing that Chinese women started to not immigrate. So already the numbers were very imbalanced between Chinese men and Chinese women. But after that law's passage, the numbers dropped 48 women to 1,000 men. So what was the result of this? This was essentially, this resulted in an inability to marry, to create a family. And so then we move into a different type of stereotype because the bachelorhood of Chinese men enhanced US suspicions of them. But you know, we would hear a different type of narrative pertaining to Chinese men or Asian men as well, you know, coming in through, also targeted to really show Asians as other or perpetual foreigner or not to be trusted or of lesser physical attributes. So this restrictive law really, what was the result? It was essentially a form of ethnic cleansing in that the population was not able to increase. So why was it that the men that were here were not able to then marry others, build other families? Well, there was, as we know, restrictive laws in many places preventing interracial marriage. So those of Asian descent could not marry outside the race, and they were not able to be reunited with family members as well. So moving on to the Chinese Exclusion Act, you know, at the time that it was passed, Chinese composed only 0.002% of the nation's population, yet this was passed. And 1854 Supreme Court case, People v. Hall, ruled that the Chinese, like African Americans and Native Americans, were not allowed to testify in court, making it effectively impossible for Chinese immigrants to seek any type of justice against any type of violence that was brewing up. And again, you know, economics plays into this. So this is, you know, a time when the railroad was built. We're seeing a lot of products from the East make it to the West. There's a lot more competition for cheaper goods. And so there were a lot of problems, you know, in the US economy, and that really pit different groups against one another, blaming each other for not being successful. And so, you know, some of the stereotypes were that Chinese workers would work for no wages, or they were just puppets of big business and really harming white workers. But this was all in order to generate propaganda and problems. So the Chinese Exclusion Act did suspend Chinese immigration for 10 years. Again, Chinese immigrants were ineligible to naturalize. It was extended another 10 years under the Geary Act. And then it was really not until 1943, under the Magnuson Act, that Chinese immigrants were able to then become citizens. But this sounds like a significant date, 1943, but it wasn't until 1965 that we really saw an increase in immigration. The Magnus Act really only resulted in, I think, a little over 100 individuals being able to immigrate. So the numbers were quite small until 1965. So it was 62 years of Chinese exclusion, ended in 1943, providing for a quota of 105 persons to immigrate each year. So you can see that those immigration patterns really affected the makeup and the face of what our composition is today. So later on, 1965, immigration laws changed, and from any single country, 20,000 individuals were allowed to come per country. So that did change the way that the United States was made up, and the number of Asians and Asian Americans that ended up populating this country. So we're going to talk a little bit. I did refer to some of these stereotypes. What do we see? You know, tremendous sexualization of women. You know, I think many of us are familiar with some of the stereotypes that we see in the media, on television, even with the violence that occurred and the murder of Asian women in Atlanta. The sexualization of those women when presented and shown in the media. People were very focused on what was their job, what were they doing, you know, who were these women, rather than essentially the crime in itself. So some of the media spin really did focus on that sexualization of Asian American women. So, you know, we see that spun a little differently in the model minority context. So I would like to invite my co-panelists to engage in the discussion on model minorities and the model minority myth.
Well, if I can just kind of briefly touch on that model minority aspect. If for those of you who don't know, a lot of Asian Americans are portrayed in media and pop culture, and even in a political sense, when the narrative surrounding Asian Americans is kind of to put them as an other or a standard, or to show that the American dream can be achieved if you are compliant and non-threatening and follow the rules, such as what they hold Asian Americans out to do. A lot of that is used to kind of show an otherness, to show as a contrast to Hispanic Americans, to African Americans, and the different struggles and racism, and I guess to show a different side of the coin, to say that, oh, Asian Americans can be successful and therefore you can too with hard work. So the myth part comes in because that's not actually true. Although Asian Americans statistically have higher median income, have higher levels of education, on the median, on the whole, it also has the largest gap. So if you're looking at income inequality, the wealth gap between the richest Asian Americans, let's say the top 10 earners, it is much wider in the Asian American population than it is across the board by, say, white Americans, African Americans, Hispanic Americans. And so when you're looking at that divide, not all Asian Americans are these overachievers, or the stereotype of the achievers or highest earners in our society. When we're looking at that, why is that? If we're looking at, historically East Asians, so that would be, like the Chinese, Japanese, Korean, which may have higher levels of secondary education and earning versus perhaps Southeast Asian, like Vietnam, Cambodia, Thailand. What's the disparity? And I think that also comes back to some immigration questions. A lot of focus on when these segments of the Asian population immigrated to the United States. You can kind of separate that out to Southeast Asian immigrants a lot of times are refugees. So they're coming from war-torn nations, after Vietnam conflict, Cambodian genocide. Those immigrants perhaps weren't in the same position as, let's say, a lot of the Japanese, Taiwanese, Chinese immigrants who came over on skilled visas like the H-1B visa. So if we're looking at that kind of a dichotomy, one size doesn't fit all. The Asian American experience isn't the same across all of this very diverse group. A lot of people will think that an Asian American is someone who looks like me, someone who's East Asian. But that could be a South Asian, Indian, Pakistan, Southeast Asian, also the Pacific and Hawaiian islands. So it's definitely, I think, an overly broad term because they don't know where to put the otherness. And I think that might be a common experience of most Asians, is that otherness, just by visually looking at someone who is, quote, Asian, you could see some different features as opposed to someone who is, non-Hispanic or white.
I think if I could
go
jump
ahead.
in real quick. Sorry.
Sure.
I think it's also really important to think about the model minority myth and how it links back to some of what we're seeing right now: hate crime victimization and Asian American experiences with that victimization. So some researchers have noted that model minority myth sort of extends to a characterization of Asian victims as also model victims, right? Who can overcome and respond to their victimization quietly. So that means, less resources directed towards dealing with that problem, but stereotypes also have impacts in terms of internalization, and then people not sort of help seeking to the same extent, sort of dealing with it on their own. So those things are important to link back, I think, to what we're seeing right now.
So the model minority myth really placing the Asian American community and only specific segments of the Asian American community against other traditionally underrepresented, vulnerable populations, really pitting them against it, because the general narrative or the dominant narrative would use something like, Japanese Americans, look how they've recovered from internment. They are such success stories. And so being able to compare one group with another group and say, why can't you be successful like this other minority group? It's a common narrative that occurs that doesn't allow different groups to come together and be able to advocate in a unified manner. So we've seen that throughout time, over and over again. Some of what Brendan just stated is talking about data reporting. When we see that for something like New York City, somewhere like New York City, we see Asians with the highest poverty rate, but the richest 10th percentile of Asians are earning more than any other racial group. It really renders the disparities virtually invisible. We're only seeing and focusing on what we're perceiving as wealth and education and model minority success. And it brings this inability for those who need help, care, support, services, from bringing forth data, coming forward. Another example that has been cited in the past is that, for the census, Asian Americans reluctant to come forward. The census was used to intern Japanese Americans. So this reluctance based on history, based on targeting, based on fear, and not really being able to communicate and unify with each other within the context of the labeled group, the identified group, but in addition with other persons of color or minority groups. So moving on a little bit, our next section is just on some personal experiences, whether it is in childhood, whether it is in the professional context. Can either of you give some examples of what you've seen, what you've experienced, how that has either pushed you forward or influenced your career choice and path?
So, personally, I grew up in a very predominantly white community in the East Coast of Florida. There weren't a lot of Asian families. And I think that I was one of maybe 4 or 5 Asian students in my high school. And we were all on the math team together, which was surprising. Another Asian stereotype. I'm not particularly good at math, but for whatever reason, I was chosen to be on the math team. So however that either positively or negatively affected me, I'll let you take your own conclusions away. My parents were in the restaurant business. We grew up with a Chinese restaurant. There are always stereotypes around Chinese food, the inequity between, what is fine dining versus what is traditionally not. There's a few documentaries out there talking about how Asian food can't really get a foothold in what Western society believes is fine dining. But, just general, what you would think of every stereotype, was successful in school, had to either choose between piano or violin. I played piano. Between tennis and dance, I did ballet. So a lot of people kind of looked at our family and said, oh, we have a tiger mom situation. There was a lot of, I guess, in the positive light, there was a lot of expectations for us to be overachieving students. And the negative side, of course, there were always microaggressions. I know that we had some people who took offense to me being Asian, would make your general like ching ching chong kind of jokes. But generally speaking, I didn't really have an overly negative experience. And my horizons and identity within the Asian American community kind of broadened when I went away to college. So I went to University of Florida. There are a lot more Asian students who were there. I think was able to connect and reconnect with my Asian side of my heritage, because there's such a large focus on assimilation, at least from my parents' standpoint, for me to be good and be included and to not have that sense of otherness.
Thank you. So I'll tell my story a little bit. My parents came, my dad is a physician. He came after the 1965 laws, but in the early 70s. And, they really thought they were coming just for a brief moment. The immigration laws were so different. They were handed a green card or permanent residency, and they really didn't appreciate or understand the meaning. They were here, for an opportunity, educational opportunity to focus and return. Things changed. Myself, my siblings started going to school. We were born in the US and continued being educated here. And my dad's practice was increasing. So it's not something that you really leave. You invest in the community. You enjoy being amongst the community. I think that what I experienced was that perpetuation of the model minority myth. So a lot of people from particular countries, we call it brain drain. They did come post 1965 because they were skilled workers. So doctors, scientists, engineers, immigrating, and so perpetuating this model minority myth. I think that, it is when you have community ties and connection and yet be so different, you don't really understand or comprehend the vulnerability that is there. So, I was in a very fortunate situation where pretty much all of my teachers, my friends, everybody was my dad's patient. But, you hear comments such as somebody who isn't, who says, well, we want somebody that we can understand. My dad speaks English really well. So, this goes into the analysis of what we talk about when we say accent discrimination. If he was speaking in a British accent or a French or some other language that is perceived as beautiful or European, this discrimination probably would not exist. So, small little things, but being exposed to the world and leaving home, constantly hearing the question, where are you from? No, really, where you're from. And I know every Asian American can really identify with this. And for me, I was always saying I'm from outside of Chicago, born in Colorado, and people really wanted to know where I was from. And I think that it's a little bit different when you come to a city like Miami. I live and practice in Miami, where over 50% of the population is foreign born. That is a very typical or common question. I think what I wasn't expecting was for people to approach me and tell me that their grandmother was from China, or that people come up to the grocery store and touch me and call me Chinita. So, these smaller things in daily life that I don't think non-Asians experience, it does make you think and consider, well, that identity is what's focused upon. And, this does have roots in the way that immigration law and policy developed, citizenship law, that biologically they are so different is how it was framed, that they will never be able to assimilate or be citizens. So that narrative has continued to this day, where me, American born, US born, still being perceived as very foreign and other, despite being Asian American, not from Korea, not from East Asia, but having been born and raised here. So how does this affect, I think, in professional context? I think the professional context, some of the perception of what Julie was saying about Tiger Mom, this follows. If you're going to be hardworking, or if you're going to be successful, you must be a Tiger Mom, be a product of a Tiger Mom. It is not just about that you want to succeed, you want to do well. And if in the professional context, that reception or that engagement, we see it across, all persons of color and women face it very much so. A white male may present themselves in a certain way, and it's considered leadership and strong. But, myself as an Asian American woman, I'm angry or I'm aggressive. It's always framed in a way that would be really with a lens that has some racial and racist undertones. I know this. I've known my spouse since I was 15 years old. We went to high school together. He teaches at a law school. We're in the same field. And, a lot of times we are in the same professional context, and we do collaborate on work. Yet we see the engagement very, very different amongst our colleagues, just because coming from an Asian American woman, the message is very different than from him. He would be perceived differently. So moving on a little bit, let's talk about hate crimes legislation. Where are we in Florida? Where are we on the federal level? What is the movement at this time?
Well, I can kind of touch on the local aspect here in Sarasota County. We don't see a lot of hate crimes in general, and we haven't had any specific instances of crimes that we would designate as or be able to enhance as a hate crime against any Asian American or Pacific Islander here within our county. So kind of how the Florida hate crimes statutes work, it's not a separate category of crime. It's not a specific crime. A hate crime isn't its own set of facts and circumstances. A hate crime can be applied as an enhancement to any crime that there is. So if we're looking at Chapter 775 specifically about enhancements, you're going to be looking at whether or not the crime that has occurred, whether it be battery or assault or a criminal mischief. It is something that has been motivated, and the main motivation is based on whether or not it's cultural, or whether or not it's religion or ancestry or ethnicity, whether that is the underlying aspect. So when we're investigating these crimes here within our county, we take that lens. All crimes carry the same amount of importance and weight. But if anything ever rose to the level of a hate crime, of course, we would be recommending those types of sanctions to the state attorney's office in order for prosecution to kind of follow with that type of investigation.
I think Julie can speak a lot more to the specifics in Sarasota County. From a basic research standpoint, there's a couple of things going on right now. So we know that fear has gone up during the COVID-19 pandemic, right? It's had a lot of impacts on everybody's mental health, right? But we also know from a research perspective that when fear increases, prejudice increases. And when prejudice increases, so does hate crime. So the problem is that right now, the xenophobia that we've seen during the pandemic is also situated within this long history of racist stereotypes that we've been talking about so far. And particularly at the beginning of the pandemic, we had politicians and political leaders willingly couching their rhetoric within those stereotypes. The World Health Organization has guidelines for this, right? They have guidelines for best practices in naming infectious diseases. And they have that for a reason. They state that disease names shouldn't include geographic locations in order to avoid negative consequences like backlash against members of particular religious or ethnic communities. And many people ignored that and disparagingly referred to the disease as the China virus and things like this anyway. And we know that sort of rhetoric legitimizes and emboldens potential hate crime offenders to act on their bigotry. So we might not be seeing it here in Sarasota County so much, but we are seeing it in a lot of other places.
Okay, thank you. What about anything that is under discussion right now on the state level? Anything that we can consider getting pushed forward? Anything that is going to be helpful or maybe restrictive? Can you give us any context on state level legislation that is in the works?
I don't have any specific examples of any legislation that's in the works. I know that the legislation on the books here in Florida lend itself easily to address any issues that may arise. So as far as hate crimes in Florida go, I don't have any statistics of, the largest number or the densest population of Asians, but, specifically here in Sarasota County, I think we have something of, 1.7% of the population in Sarasota County identifies as Asian. So there isn't really a large issue here that we need to push forward or to address. But I think that on a national level, there has been some discussion going on.
Yeah,
Brendan?
I can speak to that a little bit. So, like Julie said, the Florida law does cover, race ethnicity already. So there's that's in place. The biggest move recently has been the recently passed COVID-19 hate crime legislation. So for those people who aren't familiar with it, one of the primary purposes of that law was it did a couple of things. First, it expedites review of COVID-19 related hate crimes. And those, as we're talking about today, those hate crimes are a real issue, so they need to be addressed. They have significant impacts, not only for those who are directly victimized, but the larger community as well. So there's a symbolic effect to these laws that's really important. And if that additional review translates to additional resources and guidance, then it has the potential to make a difference. More importantly, the bill also provided for guidance for establishing online reporting avenues for hate crime. That might be particularly important moving forward because it's well established that many hate crime victims are reluctant to report their victimization to the police. Most hate crime victims do not end up reporting their victimization to the police. And some of our recent research is showing that that's particularly pronounced among the Asian American population. There are a number of potential explanations for that decreased reporting, not the least of which are cultural and structural barriers that inhibit reporting. So this new law, it introduces online reporting options available in multiple languages. So that could increase the victim reporting to the police. And increasing that reporting is really important because the inadequate measurement of hate crimes that results from underreporting has implications for the distribution of resources for dealing with the consequences of hate crime victimization. So if we're not measuring hate crime victimization accurately, we can't respond to it effectively. That said, I think that, you know, it's really important to remember that recent legislation is specifically COVID-19 hate crime legislation. So hate crimes are a bit under the microscope right now, getting more attention because of COVID-19 related increases, and they need to be addressed. But the reality is that many of these issues, they're not specific. They're not only specific to the COVID-19 pandemic, right? So a lot of the issues we're faced with tracking the hate crimes is they've been serious issues since long before the pandemic began. So I think we should be careful to view these more recent efforts at passing legislation as just one step towards addressing these issues rather than an end goal. And moving forward, laws like this should be coupled with other legislation that are aimed at long-term changes in addressing and tracking hate crimes. So that's what's going on right now at the federal level.
So I was reading some of the statistics, and they say, I read in a report by DOJ, 86% of the country's law enforcement 2019 did not report a single hate crime. So this goes back to that discussion of underreporting, and with underreporting, an inability to invest in any type of services and education programs. So, you know, the passage of the legislation, yes, very, very important, but making sure that we have the funding and the resources and the community support to continue the education piece and the engagement piece. You know, some of the criticism has been that that perhaps some of the underreporting also has to do with the fact that there's been a lack of training to law enforcement for identification, but also a reluctance to frame something as a hate crime. So hopefully with this legislation, there will be more support services and funding available from the bottom up in order to make these changes, collect data. The most important element of reviewing hate crimes, assessing whether a hate crime has occurred, what the context is that data. And if that data is not available and there is that underreporting, it's really, really hard for law enforcement to be tracking some of the issues that are occurring in our communities. So, Julie, do you have any comments to training and funding of law enforcement?
So I know that in the state of Florida, you know, we generally, most law enforcement agencies come under the umbrella of training from FDLE, which is the Florida Department of Law Enforcement. They do track different crimes, and out of the, you know, it's like a uniform crime reporting statistics. They do track hate crimes. It's up to each individual agency to report them in a manner that's consistent with how reporting is done across the state. And also, we also have to do NIBRS, which is the national reporting statistics. So when we're reporting these crimes, you know, our records departments are trained to do so in a manner that's consistent with the state and both federal, you know, strategies and their criteria. But that being said, we can't report crimes that aren't reported to us. So I think that the more that the citizens are aware and become aware that these crimes can be categorized differently or can be enhanced, I think that that will help us to be able to accurately report those statistics.
Thank you. And, you know, myself working with the immigrant community, there is such a reluctance to report crimes. Maybe not, it does exist in the Asian American community, but, you know, very much in Spanish speaking immigrant communities as well, thinking about how law enforcement is constructed in home countries. So there's this reluctance and this lack of trust to come forward when domestic violence has occurred or very very significant crimes have occurred, they're not reported because of the corruption that does exist. So I want to make just two comments and then we're going to move into questions, is the distinction between hate incidences and hate crimes. So I think it's important for us to remember that hate incidences it's going to be different than actual framing of hate crimes. So being able to document those incidents of hate, which have just exploded since March 2020 for the Asian American community, thousands and thousands of incidents have occurred throughout the nation. We've seen, I'm sure you've seen in the media, actual attacks on Asian Americans, but other hate incidents, whether it's language, whether it's access, whether it's refusal for services, whatever it may be, but the undertones of racism and hatred is there, and documenting incidents of hate on racial lines is also very important work to do, not just looking at what would fall under the umbrella of what is a hate crime. So really, really important. Also, the concept of inaction versus action. So, you know, a lot of the narrative that was happening and occurring, and the China virus and the Kung flu, and, you know, some of that language and the blame that was being used, and, you know, some of the portrayals of Chinese people eating strange foods, and that's the derivation of coronavirus and different diseases. The fact that if there's no direct action, then that inaction does become something bigger and broader. And that's what we've seen impacting the Asian American community, is the inaction and the lack of, I guess, confrontation on, you know, some of that narrative has really, really just blossomed or ballooned. I don't want to say blossomed, but, you know, really tremendously become something that it really shouldn't have in the media. So from there, we're going to go to audience questions and open it up for discussion. We'd love to hear what some of your questions are for us.
All right, thanks, gang. We're going to be presenting questions. We have Alan Perez. He'll be up first with a question. Alan, we're going to get your camera up for all of the presenters and attendees to see. And go ahead, Alan.
Thanks, Ilias. And Ms. Chung, I think it's a pretty good little segue that I did not intend to set up on what you just said. A question I had was that, what recommendations do each of you have for us prospectively, meaning as various members of our different communities, to help address or respond to or react to or deal with rhetoric or disrespectful or hateful rhetoric, keeping in mind that, you know, we all as individuals have our own views, and understanding that it's very hard to change someone's mindset. Well, what recommendations do you have for us going forward for, you know, in terms of responding to this or dealing with this or identifying it and seeing it when it does happen?
Brandon, Julie, do you want to respond first?
Well, I think that one of the key things that we can do is, in addition to just learning more and to listening to the voices who've been impacted, is to share your own personal experiences, because it will humanize and put a face to the issue. So it's well and good for, you know, for you to walk around and to carry the burden of whatever experiences that you may have. But I think that there is some healing that goes on with sharing your experiences, talking to those who have different experiences, and you can find the commonality. And a lot of times the bigotry or the hate or the racism comes from a place of ignorance and unknowing. So I think sharing your experience sometimes can help bridge that gap.
Yeah, I think the answer to that question, you know, to be quite blunt, it varies depending on, you know, whether you look like me or not, right? For me, I think my task is to actively push back on some of these things, right? I'm grateful that everyone was willing to share their experiences today. I don't have those experiences, and I know full well that that's because of the privilege that I have. So what that means for people who look like me, I think it's avoiding silence, it's pushing back on these things, and sort of not reframing them. You know, it's easy for somebody to see, somebody who looks like me to see these things happen on the street and say, well, maybe I didn't see what I thought I saw, but that's not an effective way to address these things, right? So I think that's really important, to push back and avoid silence whenever possible.
I agree with my co-panelists. I really think that learning really comes from a much earlier stage and engagement on an earlier stage. We're seeing that shift in different communities about trying to engage in DEI and DNI initiatives in their curriculum, and talking about this history that is American history. You know, I think that's one element. Another element being that commonalities with different people of color, different minority groups, and people who have struggled, they're not the same. Obviously, they're not the same struggles, and they're not supposed to be the same struggles. But I think categorizing them and feeling that there's only one place for that discussion to happen, or there's only one group that can be advanced, is exactly what the dominant narrative seeks to do, as opposed to there's space for all of these stories, this history, and being able to address them and overcome them as a common theme, but not in experience. So I think that that's what has faced a lot of different persons of color being able to come together. It is, the pie is only this big, and we need to have the microphone on that pie, piece of the pie. So hopefully we can get beyond that, and that the pitting of different groups against each other we can move beyond that in today's education.
All right, thank you very much. We have another question. This one actually comes from Judge Williams. And what he's asking is, are there any statewide initiatives to increase the Asian American presence within the Florida bar?
I don't have an answer to that. I'm not aware specifically of any Asian American or initiatives targeted towards Asian Americans. I know our diversity and inclusion committee, we're very focused on the ground up initiatives of bringing children, high school students, college students into the legal field, becoming leaders in their community. And I hope that that would encompass all underrepresented communities, but I'm not aware of anything specific targeted towards Asian American.
This is Charlie Ann speaking, if I may, Elias. What I am aware of is that our state committee is increasing our focus on the pipeline, starting from middle schools, going on through high schools, colleges, and in particular law schools. I can also add that on the Board of Governors level, finally, they've recognized that they themselves need to create a diversity committee, and that is supposed to be approved by the convention of this year. So we are very, very much aware of the disproportionate number of white lawyers versus lawyers of colors, and we are going to work to improve that. So the short answer is we're very much aware of that disparity, and we're focused on increasing those numbers. And I will continue to keep you posted on any growth in that area.
And I know that there are several local bar associations that, like AAPI, and there are regional ones for South Florida, for Tampa Bay, et cetera. And a lot of that has to do with mentorship. So, they'll reach out to law schools. And I was, in an Asian American law student association at Stetson, where we partnered with AAPI, which is the bar association, to have mentorship. And so I still keep in contact with my mentor. So I think that, those types of groups will help foster a sense of community and belonging within the Florida Bar Association as well.
Okay. And one more question. This one actually I have for our speakers. And Julie, you mentioned earlier about your parents and how they wanted you to assimilate. And I think that different cultures, as they immigrate to this country, do that differently. And when we're talking about the model minority myth, can we discuss potentially the difference with an assimilation approach that some immigrant cultures have versus an acculturation approach? Is that different with Asian Americans versus other minorities? Has that impacted the model minority myth? And how does that impact, if at all, the Asian American experience?
I mean, I can only speak to my own personal experience, and I don't want to kind of speak on the whole of all Asian Americans, but even within my own family, the approach for assimilation or not to assimilate was different between siblings. So, my parents came in the early 80s. My sister was born in 82, and they did not teach her to speak English as her first language. So her first language was Mandarin Chinese. And they saw the struggle that she had when she went to school, the ridicule, the bullying, and the issues that she had. And they decided to have a different approach when they had me. I was born in 86. So, a few years later, they exclusively spoke English to me. They did not have me do a lot of the things that they did with my sister, culturally speaking. And so I think that they saw the difficulties that my sister was having and adjusted their approach. So even within one family with two separate approaches, it was a little bit harder because then after I got through high school, and both my sister and I had taken multiple trips to Taiwan and to China as we were growing up, to be with other family members, to see where my parents came from. And there was always an otherness in that as well. So not only are you not American enough in your home of the United States, but then you are not Asian enough when you are in Asia. You are the American cousins or family members. You speak with an accent. I didn't really learn how to speak Chinese until my grandparents came to live in the States, and I had to by necessity because they didn't speak English. I went on to go and study East Asian language and literature in college to kind of reconnect. But I mean, it's so difficult to say whether the approach for assimilation is what perpetuates the model minority myth. But I think in my particular case, we did it both ways in our family. And, it eventually had the same kind of outcome. My sister is a dentist, is successful practicing in California. I'm an attorney. My parents, had us both here in the States and did two different approaches. So I really can't tell you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Julie. So I think this concludes our program.
Well, we have one
The
more.
judge, yes.
We have one more question. What can, talking to the panelists, what can our audience members do to help combat anti-Asian American Pacific Islander, Native Hawaiian bias and hate?
I mean,
Julie, Brandon.
I can go first. So I talked about this a little bit because I think about this a lot in my work. I think the most important thing is just to start with, it's super obvious, but not contributing to the issue by perpetuating these stereotypes that we've been talking about today. The second most important thing, though, especially as we were talking about, if you look like me and you're wondering what can I do, it's actively push back on those issues. So you can do that in a couple of ways. First, avoiding silence. When we're silent, we communicate the message that fighting racism and prejudice is someone else's problem. So speaking up is effective. Second, stop reframing. When we see or witness bias and reframe it or downplay it, we're facilitating that hateful behavior occurring again somewhere else. Even if it's, this is someone we thought was our friend and he said this thing. You don't just let it slide by saying something. You're preventing him from doing that again, at least in your company. Right. So, stop downplaying and reframing these things. And then I think we all need to think big picture. So ignoring the systemic and structural problems that incubate these biases, that also facilitates hate. So AAPI hate and bias will continue so long as we perpetuate the belief that it doesn't exist, that it's been overcome somehow, the model minority stereotype, or that it, this is a problematic one too, that it only exists among a small group of bigots or prejudiced people, right? It's more systemic than that. So I think thinking about all of those things is important.
I would echo those same sentiments. And again, having those difficult conversations with people, if you are on the receiving end of AAPI hate or bias, or have anti-AAPI incidents occur to you, share your experiences.
I would say, going back to the education piece, whether it's with children, whether offering your time to schools, engaging with high school level individuals. Part of the programming that we do on the Diversity and Inclusion Committee is that, as Charlie Ann said, is that pipeline, furthering that engagement and talking about Asian American issues and what's happening in the legal context, and also providing those mentorship opportunities for attorneys to find those leadership positions, whether it's in the community and in government, making sure that we do promote those diversity and inclusion initiatives to give that visibility to the Asian American community, and elevating them to be leaders and have that engagement. So some of these myths are dispelled, or this lack of assimilation or foreigner concept is dispelled.
Thank you. Thank you so much to each of you and to our viewers. We'll post a link to this video to the Sarasota County Bar Association's Facebook page, and we will have it available viewing from the Sarasota County Bar Association YouTube channel. We welcome your comments and continued dialogue. And don't forget to like and share with friends and colleagues on your preferred social media channels. If we have piqued your interest, please reach out to us with your thoughts and ideas. We always welcome new perspectives. Thanks again to the Community Foundation of Sarasota County for sponsoring today's presentation. And thank you for joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.